Are you already recording? Are you already recording? No, well, what happens is that... We're going to our first presentation here in...
At the Domo Care.
The Domo Care, exactly.
At the Domo Care?
If there's a city that's synonymous with violence and impunity, it's Reynosa, or, well, in general, the state of Tamaulipas. And the case we're going to talk about today is no exception to this rule. It occurred on May 25, 2025, just a week ago. The case is still not closed, but the path the investigation is taking seems to be the same as always. A filed folder and a family without a clear answer about what really happened in this magical Mexico.
From Matamoros heading to Valle Hermoso, you can see the meadows and my rivers.
Grupo Fugitivo was a corrido band that had just started, but they had a clear dream to become known all over Mexico. Unfortunately, their name would be on everyone's lips overnight, but not for the reasons they would have wanted. What really happened to this group of young people? Why did they become linked to drug trafficking? That's what I'll cover in this video. But first, let's start with the story. Grupo Fugitivo was, or is, a regional norteño music group with simple lyrics about love and heartbreak. They hadn't achieved fame yet. They didn't even have a single song recorded in a studio. Still, they dreamed of filling stadiums, being on television, and getting countless YouTube views. But they also knew that they still had a long way to go before they could achieve that dream. Well, let's say like every musician who's just starting out.
They performed in bars, local venues, and private events.
However, they weren't doing badly either. Wherever they played, people enjoyed their music and remembered their melodies. They were ordinary young men who shared the same dream. Besides, they all came from different neighborhoods in Tamaulipas and had started out playing at family events. Little by little, they started moving up, playing at private parties or palapas, imitating the structure of the stages they dreamed of reaching. They went from town to town in a van that had their logo displayed prominently.
Alright folks, we are Grupo Fugitivo, just letting you know that we're now available for all kinds of events for all the great people who want the band live.
Grupo Fugitivo members were Ozon Francisco Vázquez Osorio, Victor Garza Cervantes, Nemesio Durán Rodríguez, Francisco Morales Martínez, Livan Solis de la Rosa, and Carlos González. The lead singer and the others had been together for many years, having been part of another group before forming this one. Most of the members were young adults who were just beginning to discover the cruel world around them. Except for Nemesio Durán, a 40-year-old man with a deep voice, serious look, and lots of kindness. The musician had scars on his lip and forehead that showed a long life of struggles. Conversely, Ivan Solis, 27, was the group's representative. He was the one who organized everything, the one on whom their future in the music world depended, the one who talked to contractors and bar owners. Third was Francisco Morales, a polite 23-year-old who loved his family. On his left shoulder, he has his father's face tattooed, who always supported him in his dream of becoming a well-known musician. Carlos González was the last to join the group in January 2025. There was also Francisco Vázquez, the youngest, only 20 years old. He is thin, with black hair, as he would later be described in his missing person reports. Also, he always wore his shirt tucked into his pants, which was, well, a characteristic habit of his trademark. And finally, Victor Garza, just 1 year older than Francisco, although he was about to turn 22. He was only 4 days away, but he disappeared before he could celebrate them. He was cheerful and playful, almost always dressed in black, and he always wore a silver fossil watch on his wrist, which his mother had proudly given him. He was a young guy, but he was already a family man with a wife and 3 children. Victor learned to play the guitar by watching YouTube videos, just like many young people his age. He was a guy who always helped those who needed it most. In fact, recently, because of the floods in Reynosa, he was delivering food and clothes, but sadly, his kindness would be extinguished in the worst way. And with this, we're going to get into the disappearance. Sunday, May 25th, 2025. The group, Fugitivo, had finished a show at a venue located in the Rivera de Rancho Grande neighborhood, on the border between Mexico and the United States. To their surprise, that same night, they had landed a second show.
The group was called for a private event in the town of Reynosa. The 4 musicians and their manager got into this black van which they used to go to all their performances.
Excited about the new opportunity, they got into their black GMC van heading to a supposed private performance in the Riveras neighborhood in Reynosa. Carlos Gonzalez, the lead singer, didn't get into the vehicle as he had things to take care of and would arrive later. At that moment, obviously he didn't know it, but this decision would change his life forever. And that's because his bandmates said goodbye to him and set off for a place from which they never returned. Before 10 o'clock at night, Carlos Jimenez arrived at the meeting place in another vehicle. When he got out of the car, he found a scene very different from what he expected. There was no entrance, no building nearby, no music could be heard, not even any lighting, just an empty lot with no trace of his companions. At that moment, he knew something was amiss. Perhaps the global positioning system had erred and it was all a misunderstanding. However, his alarms went off when he tried to contact them without success. All the cell phones were turned off, which was no longer normal. Worried, Carlos called the relatives thinking that maybe they could be back home after the fiasco. He found the place empty with no show or anyone answering the phone. To his dismay, even the relatives had no information about his companion's whereabouts, leaving him distressed. At first, neither Carlos nor the relatives wanted to panic. They still hoped that they would return safe and sound. And well, it's not unusual in this kind of cities or in these kinds of states that if they play for dangerous people, their cell phones are taken away so that neither they nor those people are put in danger. So the relatives thought maybe they shouldn't panic just yet. But with the first rays of sunlight on Monday morning, worry turned into anguish and then into desperation. Victor Manuel Garza's family thought that maybe he and his colleagues would arrive home in the morning because maybe they had stopped somewhere for breakfast. But as the hours passed and they realized the heartbreaking reality, something had already happened to them. That's what they thought.
After going to a bar in Reynosa on Sunday night, since then there has been no trace of them.
The families of all the missing people began searching in the surrounding areas. They shared photos and physical descriptions of the 5 individuals on social media. The first missing person flyers circulated on social media thanks to the group Amor por los Desaparecidos. Although since early Monday, May 27, through various social media and WhatsApp search groups, the musicians' families were asking for the public's help to find their whereabouts. The Tamaulipas State Attorney General's office only received the missing persons report at night.
Family members, friends, and search groups held various demonstrations to demand that the authorities locate them.
Meanwhile, the authorities began their investigation. Friends, musicians from the same genre, and family members were already holding several protests in iconic locations in the border city to demand that the ministerial investigations into the disappearance be carried out quickly. There was no time to lose. Grupo Fugitivo had to appear but alive. However, hopes were slowly being shattered. Hours later, the truck they were traveling in was found abandoned in the neighborhood La Cañada. However, it was missing the group's logos as if they wanted to hide the truth. There were no signs of the occupants inside the vehicle.
This is the GMC truck in which these young people were traveling, the one that took them to the event where they performed.
But a disturbing discovery shocked the families. The forensic experts found traces of blood in the car. At that moment, they didn't know it, but that evidence was a sign of what they were about to find. On Tuesday, 2 days post-disappearance, everything changed. From the start of the probe, the prosecutor's office pursued a lead via the surveillance system of the Command, Control, Computing, Communications, and Citizen Contact Center 5, and the tracking of the cell phones before they were turned off at 10 o'clock at night.
Based on video analysis and phone tracking, the prosecutor's office was able to establish a route.
Those signals eventually led them to a property near the Aquiles Cerdon neighborhood. The place was a brick factory in Ejido Los Longoria on the banks of the Bravo River. Then, after 5 days of uncertainty and desperation, on May 29th, the prosecutor's office announced the discovery of 5 charred bodies.
They found the bodies, yes, you heard right, the bodies of the members of Grupo Fugitivo.
Although there was evidence that made them think these were the members of the group, they did not confirm it officially. According to the prosecutor in the case, it was believed that the musicians were taken there to be killed. And from that moment on, the contradictions began. The prosecutor's office, on one hand, claimed that the bodies had already been identified as the Fugitivo group. But the family still hadn't submitted their deoxyribonucleic acid samples to confirm it, and they still hadn't seen the bodies. They were just fragments, but nothing that could identify them at first glance. So I asked myself, how could they take it for granted that it was these 5 boys?
Indeed, the Tamaulipas State Attorney General's office confirmed that the bodies found burned in a field in the Aquiles Cerdan neighborhood in Reynosa belonged to the members of the musical group Fugitivo.
How could they make such a strong statement, like saying those were their bodies, without first doing DNA tests? Besides these tests, from what I understand, it takes some time to get the results, but that wasn't the worst part. Actually, no official source had informed them of this discovery. The mothers of the missing had found out from the news and social media that their children were no longer alive. Finding this out through the media is shocking and sad. Can you imagine that? How is it possible that the information reached social media and the press before the families? That's the million-dollar question. But in this magical Mexico, anything is possible. Hours after this scandal and with social pressure on their shoulders, the forensic experts finally took the genetic samples. But things wouldn't be so easy from that moment on. And why am I telling you this? Because the place where they were found is still being processed in order to find evidence that will help understand the motive and circumstances of how the members of the musical group Fugitivo were deprived of their lives. According to the prosecutor's office, it was members of a criminal cell of the Gulf Cartel called Los Metros, which operates precisely in the city of Reynosa. This cartel had split into several factions, among them Los Metros, Los Ciclones, Los Escorpiones, and Los Rojos. Just a few days after the discovery then, the authorities were already talking about a closed case, an executed crime, and a defined motive, deprivation of liberty followed by homicide. But this didn't seem enough for the relatives and everyone who had been closely following the case. In fact, one of the strongest hypotheses was an alleged crime of passion. Apparently, it was believed that there was a dark background involving one of the musicians from Grupo Fugitivo and a leader of organized crime. Following this theory, the musicians had been hired to play at an alleged party organized by one of these Gulf factions, and it was coordinated by a man known as Rocho. Ulises Raga Ortiz, also known as El Faluca and also known as El Metro 40 or M40, also came into the picture. A figure from Reynosa accused of coordinating the murder of police officers, destroying surveillance cameras, and running hitman networks under the shield of the Gulf Cartel. According to this theory, El Faluca had a jealous outburst with one of the musicians, and the party ended in tragedy. Only one of the members was his target, but he couldn't leave any loose ends, so they ended up taking the lives of everyone, the whole group. So this being the main theory, the authorities ended up capturing El Faluca, accused of being responsible for this event. However, it was the cartel itself that supposedly agreed to hand over this person as the one responsible for the crime. Apparently, the same social and media pressure led them to hand him over, but that obviously did not calm the demand for justice. Apparently, the cartel tried to hand him over as a scapegoat to calm the media pressure and thus put an end to the investigations.
This even led his loved ones to protest in order to speed up the investigation of the case in a town plagued by organized crime.
The families of the musicians did not stay silent and took to the streets in front of the cameras and on social media. They repeated the same thing over and over again, that there was not enough evidence to confirm that the bodies found were those of their missing relatives. The families of the musicians pointed directly at Governor Americo Villarreal Anaya for downplaying the tragedy and for asking the families to remain calm. But above all, for lying to their faces. The governor and the Secretary of Security had assured them that the young men were alive and on their way to the prosecutor's office. But it was a lie. They never saw them. On the other hand, Jimena Vasquez, sister of Francisco Vasquez, said bluntly at a press conference that they wanted the case to be handled by the Attorney General's office because they no longer trusted the Tamaulipas prosecutor's office. She also demanded to speak directly with Claudia Sheinbaum and the Secretary of the Interior, Rosa Isela Rodriguez, saying, "We don't want any more lies." In the words of this young woman, which also became the slogan of the relatives.
They managed to arrest 9 individuals considered likely responsible for the events mentioned.
Meanwhile, the protest did not stop, and the media pressure became more and more suffocating. The authorities reported the arrest in the Aquiles Cerdan neighborhood of 9 people allegedly linked to Los Metros. During the arrest, they seized high-caliber weapons and 2 vehicles. But once again, things didn't seem to be going down the path of truth. The prosecutor's office confirmed the discovery without evidence. No legal protocols were followed during the arrest. It was as if they wanted to close the case and shelve it as soon as possible, grabbing 9 Christians.
They were put into the vehicles and later taken to the state prosecutor's office, where they also went to request some official information about the arrest. However, they haven't been given any response.
Rumors quickly began to spread that the arrests were full of irregularities. Apparently, excessive force had been used, entering homes without court orders. And they had forced the detainees to dress as soldiers, which suggested that everything had been staged.
They barged us in, breaking down the doors. My husband was naked, but they dressed him as a soldier, just like they're dressed now.
The wife, in fact, of one of the detainees stated that her husband worked in a workshop, but that the authorities had broken into their home and using force without explaining what he was being accused of.
They put me in the bathroom and hit me here. They just kept hitting me here. I held my daughter in my arms and asked them to take me outside so she wouldn't see them hitting me. And no, they didn't want to.
Of the 9 people arrested, at least 3 worked at the local brick factories where the remains were found. Among them are Juan Carlos Saucedo, 28 years old, Alfredo Barajas, 60, and Fernando Hernandez, who, by the way, has a disability. Their relatives claimed that they were all simply employees or are employees and denied that they were criminals. However, for the prosecutor's office, that was enough to make them suspects. In fact, there is another one of these 9 who they say worked as an Uber or Didi driver. In the middle of this scandal, on June 1st, 2025 elections were held in Tamaulipas to choose, or well, throughout all of Mexico, to choose district judges through direct voting. Well, let's call it a democratic experiment, which really isn't democratic at all, that promises transparency and, above all, the elimination of fraud and corruption. But, well, with the mishandling of the Grupo Fugitivo case, all the citizens came together with the same demand. When they opened the ballot boxes to count the votes, the ballots were written with phrases that expressed the discontent of the entire people. Grupo Fugitivo is missing. Phrases like, where are they, as well? No more silence, we're missing 5. They turned the vote into a silent protest. Meanwhile, the politicians in this city spoke to the press after casting their votes. And well, they couldn't escape the journalists' questions about the case of the missing young people. The governor said the following: the important thing is that we have people in custody, people, weapons, and trafficking equipment. That gives us clarity about the case. As if the lives of these kids didn't matter. But anyway, in addition to the 9 questionable arrests, on June 2nd, 3 other individuals were arrested who apparently would also be alleged members of drug trafficking, accused of being involved in the death of the musicians. Santosen, also known as M47, would be the alleged operations chief of this criminal group, and he is accused of being the mastermind behind taking the lives of the members of Grupo Fugitivo. The other 2 individuals captured are Raul N. and Jesus Alejandro N.
The man, identified as Santos N, also known as M47 or El Jimmy, is believed to be the operations chief of the Gulf Cartel. During the operation, 2 other men linked to the Metros faction of the Gulf Cartel were captured.
During the arrests made at their homes located in Reynosa, the agents seized a couple of long guns, 3 handguns, ammunition, 12 vehicles, as well as around 21 kilos of this herb of happiness, of white gold, of other synthetic drugs, and cash, which also, on the other hand. And another theory from the investigators about the motive for this tragic event is whether the attack could be related to narco corridos, songs that glorify criminal leaders and can provoke retaliation from rival cartels. However, the relatives deny any connection between the band and organized crime, assuring that the group was dedicated to performing cumbias, romantic ballads, and popular corridos at local parties, but never related to crime. And so, once again, justice seems to want to close the case as soon as possible, this time blaming the victims themselves.
Speak up and reject corruption. The government of Tamaulipas just wants to close the case. looking for people to blame who are actually innocent.
Finally, the case has generated so much outrage in the country, not just in Reynosa. Relatives and colleagues of the musical group blocked the Reynosa Far International Bridge and held vigils demanding justice.
Later, they went to the Reynosa International Bridge, which was the last place. These members of Grupo Fugitivo made a video that they posted on their social media.
The Nuevo Laredo Human Rights Committee stated that Nuevo Laredo is another city in Tamaulipas. They stated that the work of the state prosecutor's office was not carried out as a serious investigation and that everything could be a simulation of acts of justice just to close the case.
I'm telling you, this issue has the population divided because while some are searching for their missing relatives, others are demanding the release of 3 of the 9 detainees who are accused of the alleged murder of the members of Grupo Fugitivo.
Tragically, this incident joins cases like Los Norteños del Rio Bravo in 2018 and El Combo Colombia in 2013. Crimes that highlight the vulnerability of musicians in regions marked by drug cartel violence. Those who, even though they try to follow a musical path away from these criminals, end up falling one way or another. Carlos Gonzalez, by the way, the survivor of this Grupo Fugitivo, is in a state of shock. This is evident, still unable to understand how all his colleagues remain missing. Currently, fortunately, he remains safe, but his whereabouts are confidential, obviously for security reasons.
They are fragments. Nobody has been found to confirm that it is our relative.
So far, the results of the forensic analysis or the deoxyribonucleic acid analysis are still pending. Meanwhile, the families are not just sitting and waiting. On the contrary, they continue searching for them alive and will keep searching until they are proven otherwise. These have been difficult times for the mothers, wives, and children who are waiting for their loved ones to return safe and sound. Let's hope this happens. However, the pain of uncertainty persists in the homes, but they still hold on to faith and hope of finding them alive soon. As I said, let's hope they are back soon, safe and sound. Before finishing, I want to mention that this is a very recent case. And what I'm telling you is information that's current as of the 4th, Wednesday the 4th. If there's new info by Friday not covered in this video, I'll likely make a part 2 for you.